On February 13, 1924, Captain Isoroku Yamamoto joined a Japanese naval delegation at the United States Naval War College in Rhode Island. At 40 years of age and a seasoned veteran of the Battle of Tsushima, where he had lost 2 fingers, he was already well-versed from his earlier studies at Harvard University between 1919 and 1921. This wasn't Yamamoto's initial visit to America. Rather, it marked the continuation of an educational journey that would profoundly influence his understanding of industrial might and military strategy. During his 2 years in Cambridge, while officially enrolled as a special student in English, with a focus on economics and petroleum resources, Yamamoto's true education came from his travels. He took advantage of summer breaks to hitchhike across the country, an unusual practice for a Japanese naval officer, which allowed him unparalleled insights into American industrial operations. His journeys included visits to oil fields in Texas and Mexico, where he learned about drilling techniques, refining processes, and transportation logistics. By the time he finished his studies at Harvard, Yamamoto's knowledge of petroleum production was so extensive that several American oil companies offered him employment. However, he declined these offers as his primary commitment remained with Japan's Navy. Nevertheless, these job offers underscored how deeply he had immersed himself in the technical and economic intricacies of the petroleum industry. Yamamoto noticed stark contrasts between American business practices and those of Japan. He was amazed by the scale at which American companies operated, employing thousands of workers in their manufacturing facilities and transporting materials over vast distances across the continent. The infrastructure supporting these industries was far more developed than what Japan could muster. He witnessed the vast scale of American agriculture in the Midwest, where farms extended as far as the eye could see. Mechanization was revolutionizing agricultural productivity. A single American farm could produce more grain than an entire Japanese village. This surplus allowed for the sustenance of enormous industrial cities. By contrast, Japan had difficulty feeding its population even during peacetime. Any prolonged conflict would likely result in severe food shortages that could become catastrophic. He toured steel production facilities in Pittsburgh and observed continuous operation at the mills with astonishing output. American steel production in the early 1920s surpassed 50 million tons annually, while Japan's total yearly output was around 2 million tons. This significant disparity in steel production would likely decide any future industrial war, he noted. Additionally, shipbuilding capabilities on both coasts were impressive. American shipyards could launch vessels at rates unmatchable by Japan. The infrastructure, skilled labor force, supply chains, and capital investments all contributed to making American shipbuilding a strategic asset. Everywhere Yamamoto looked, there was unused capacity in peacetime factories that could easily be ramped up during wartime. 1. Staff and introduce extra work shifts. Work shifts. Industrial capabilities were substantial yet largely unused. Yamamoto began to foster what he referred to later as a healthy appreciation for American manufacturing might. However, this respect did not fully capture the depth of his understanding. It was clear that Japan would struggle in an extended industrial conflict with America due to unfavorable odds. Shortly after returning from his visit to the Naval War College, sometime in February or March 1924, Yamamoto undertook another journey that solidified what he had learned. He went to southeast Texas to meet a small Japanese farming community near Orange, which was owned by Kitamatsu Kishi, a comrade from the Russo-Japanese War and an alumnus of the University of Tokyo. In 1906, Kishi immigrated to America in search of land for rice cultivation. After investigating possible locations in California and the southern states, he chose property near Terry at that time, praising its flat terrain, abundant rainfall, and welcoming locals. He purchased 3 5-times acres for $72,000. The Kishi settlement grew to include a peak population of 32 men, 5 women, and 4 children. They successfully cultivated rice until World War I disrupted their operations when saltwater intrusion into Tal Bayou, their main irrigation source, damaged the crops after the ship channel expansion between Sabine Lake and the Sabine River. Following the war's conclusion, Falling rice prices compelled them to diversify into vegetables, cotton, figs, and livestock. In 1919, oil was discovered on Kishi's land, leading to a sudden transformation when drilling struck an enormous salt dome that fueled the orange oil field boom of the 1920s. This find swiftly made Kishi a millionaire. He managed to settle all his debts and subsequently acquired more land, eventually amassing 9,000 acres. He then leased drilling rights to Gulf Production Company, Sun Oil Company, and Humble Oil and Refining Company. Count Kojiro Matsukata, the president of Kawasaki Dock Company, made a significant investment in Kishi's venture, leading to the formal establishment of the Orange Petroleum Company. Yamamoto's visit to this small Japanese oil operation in Texas was driven by strategic considerations. Japan was expanding its naval force under the 8-8 plan, which mandated at least 8 battleships and 8 cruisers as a minimum standard. This expansion required substantial amounts of oil that Japan could not produce domestically. Yamamoto was exploring whether Japanese interests could establish reliable petroleum sources outside direct control but within reach of Japanese capital and expertise. He was accompanied by Vice Admiral Kenji, a high-ranking official who would later hold important naval positions, and Michio Kaku, Yamamoto's longtime traveling companion, who served as a counselor at the Japanese embassy in Washington. Kaku would eventually become head of the New Orleans Japanese consulate, maintaining his ties to Japanese business interests in the American South. During their visit, they examined Kishi's drilling operations, discussing production rates, refining capabilities, and transportation logistics. They also addressed the technical challenges associated with oil extraction and the economic feasibility of smaller-scale petroleum ventures. It remains unclear from surviving records whether he was referring specifically to wartime planning or general naval expansion. Following their visit, Yamamoto reportedly advised Nippon Petroleum Company to consider establishing operations in America to secure essential oil resources for the Japanese Navy. However, the company declined this suggestion. Japanese petroleum companies preferred importing oil rather than investing in foreign production facilities. This decision, like many others, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of strategic vulnerability. Japan was building a modern navy that required large quantities of oil, most of which came from potential adversaries, while the country's industry did little to develop alternative sources or reduce dependency. Yamamoto recognized the issue with remarkable clarity. Oil would be a decisive factor in future conflicts. Japan relied on imports for 90% of its oil needs, with 80% coming from the United States. His visit to Texas underscored everything he had noticed during his 2-year stay at Harvard. American petroleum resources were immense, while Japanese reserves were practically non-existent. The disparity could not be bridged by sheer determination or strategy. It was a reality dictated by geology and geography that would define any future war. Yamamoto grasped the implications. Japan would face an adversary that supplied most of its oil and produced 63% of the world's petroleum output. This strategic weakness left Japan vulnerable on multiple fronts. Years later, Yamamoto articulated his understanding of American industrial might in a statement widely quoted among Japan's military and political leadership. Anyone who has seen the automobile factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan does not possess the national strength to compete with America in naval warfare. While it is uncertain whether Yamamoto personally toured car plants in Detroit, what is evident is his comprehension of how American automotive production was a form of industrial capacity adaptable for military purposes. The assembly lines used to manufacture civilian vehicles could swiftly shift to producing tanks and trucks. Similarly, manufacturing facilities that produced cars during peacetime could rapidly convert to weapon production during wartime. Japan lacked the necessary infrastructure, expertise, and scale in this regard. Upon his return to Japan in 1924, Admiral Yamamoto carried with him a firm belief that would guide his professional life. Japan should avoid a protracted conflict with the United States due to the industrial advantages of its adversary. This conviction was grounded in the understanding that such a war was unwinnable for Japan, although persuading his country's leadership of this truth remained challenging throughout the 1920s and 1930s. During these decades, Yamamoto advanced within the Imperial Japanese Navy, consistently advocating against a potential confrontation with America. His promotion to captain in 1923 underscored his expanding influence and strategic insight. In 1924, Yamamoto made a pivotal career move by switching from gunnery to naval aviation, an unconventional path for a senior officer at the time. Gunnery had traditionally been the route to high-ranking positions within navies worldwide, whereas naval aviation was still in its infancy and often viewed with skepticism by conservative military figures. However, during his studies at Harvard University, Yamamoto had carefully examined World War I aerial combat reports and recognized that aircraft would revolutionize naval warfare. He foresaw that carrier-based planes would eventually supplant battleship artillery as the dominant force on the high seas. By specializing in naval aviation, Yamamoto positioned himself at the vanguard of a tactical shift that would significantly influence World War II. His initial significant appointment within this field was as executive officer at Kasamigora Naval Air Training School, located 40 miles northeast of Tokyo. This institution had been established following recommendations by British military advisors and served as the principal training ground for Japan's naval aviators. Yamamoto implemented several innovations that markedly enhanced pilot education. He insisted on rigorous night flying instruction, a technique many navies deemed too perilous for regular training regimens. Additionally, he advocated for more authentic combat simulations and stringent carrier landing qualifications. Although some pilots felt that Yamamoto's regimen was overly demanding and impractical, his approach significantly raised the standards of aerial proficiency in the Japanese Navy. Yamamoto's reply was recorded in several documents. The Japanese fleet is considerably behind its Western counterparts, leaving little room for catching up. Therefore, I equate risking one's life during training to dying heroically on the battlefield. If we are unwilling to face such risks while training, we will not be ready when war breaks out. This philosophy was tough but highly effective. As a result, Japanese naval aviators became some of the best-trained pilots globally. When the Pacific War commenced in 1941, Japanese carrier pilots were tactically superior to their American counterparts due to Yamamoto's insistence on rigorous training standards set in the early 1920s. From 1926 to 1928, Yamamoto returned to the United States for his second prolonged stay, serving as naval attaché at the Japanese embassy in Washington. By then, he was a captain with an expanding reputation within the Imperial Japanese Navy. His mission was to study American naval advancements, evaluate their shipbuilding programs, and comprehend their strategic thinking. During this second tour of duty in America, Yamamoto extensively traveled. He visited numerous American naval bases and observed fleet maneuvers. He also attended social gatherings where he met many American naval officers who would later become adversaries in the Pacific War. When questioned about his quick mastery of bridge, Yamamoto responded that memorizing 5,000 Chinese and Japanese characters made keeping track of 52 playing cards relatively easy. His gambling prowess impressed American officers, but also led him to develop a disdain for the complacency he observed in many American naval leaders. He felt that many were more engrossed in golf and social events than professional development, viewing the United States Navy as little more than a club for such activities. This evaluation held some truth but was seriously lacking in completeness. It is accurate that American military leaders during peacetime were not as intensely dedicated compared to their Japanese counterparts. However, the American naval leadership had a more profound grasp of industrial mobilization than Yamamoto's fellow officers within the Imperial Navy. Moreover, Yamamoto's second visit to America reinforced all his previous conclusions regarding the nation's industrial capabilities. He observed that U.S. industrial shipyards were expanding rapidly, steel production was on the rise, and oil output was increasing steadily. The disparity between American and Japanese industrial capacities did not decrease, instead it grew wider. In 1929, Yamamoto attained the rank of Rear Admiral at age 45 and assumed the role of Chief of the Technological Division within the Naval Air Corps, which gave him significant influence over aircraft development programs. He vigorously advocated for the creation of fast carrier-based fighter planes that boasted enhanced range and superior maneuverability. His efforts directly contributed to the development of the Mitsubishi A6M fighter, which would dominate Pacific airspace during the initial stages of World War II. The Zero fighter encapsulated Yamamoto's vision of how carrier aviation would shape naval warfare. Designed with an emphasis on range and agility rather than armor or pilot protection, it could fly longer distances and outmaneuver any adversary. With well-trained pilots at the controls, it proved highly effective in combat scenarios. However, its lack of protective features like armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that a single hit often resulted in catastrophic failure. The design philosophy embraced high tactical superiority while accepting greater risk for pilot casualties. This strategy proved effective in the early stages of the war when Japan had seasoned pilots, but it turned disastrous as replacements with insufficient training and experience failed to capitalize on the Zero's strength while exposing its weaknesses. In 1930, Yamamoto participated in the London Naval Conference as part of Japan's delegation. The conference aimed to revise and extend the Washington Naval Treaty from 1922, which had set construction limits for capital ships among major naval powers. According to this treaty, Japan was restricted to building 3 battleships or aircraft carriers for every 5 constructed by the United States or Britain, resulting in a ratio of 3:1. By 1930s, Japanese nationalists and military leaders found this limitation increasingly unacceptable. Yamamoto vehemently advocated for naval equality with Western powers during the conference. He referred to the current ratio as a national humiliation and demanded equal rights for Japan's navy. His arguments were compelling and well-articulated, emphasizing that security threats necessitated a larger fleet. He highlighted how Japan's geographic position required robust naval forces to safeguard vital sea routes critical for its survival. However, while Yamamoto publicly championed parity, he privately acknowledged that the push for equality was driven more by national pride than strategic necessity. Japan simply did not possess the industrial capacity to compete in an arms race with America. Even if treaty restrictions were lifted, Japan could not match American shipbuilding capabilities due to factors such as steel production, shipyard capacity, skilled labor, and capital investment, disadvantages that no treaty revisions could alter. Yamamoto's public stance on naval parity was a matter of political expediency, reflecting the demands of Japanese public opinion and nationalist pressures. Opposing the treaty would have been politically disastrous and likely ruined his career, but his personal stance remained steadfast. It was not the limitations imposed by treaties that hindered Japan's ability to rival American naval strength. Rather, it was the country's industrial capabilities. In 1934, Yamamoto commanded the 1st Carrier Division, overseeing Japan's most advanced naval aviation units. His extensive study of carrier operations led him to develop doctrines for large-scale carrier strikes that would later be used at Pearl Harbor and throughout early Pacific campaigns. In 1935, Yamamoto headed the Japanese delegation to a second London Naval Conference. By then, international relations had markedly deteriorated. Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was condemned by the League of Nations, leading to Japan's withdrawal from the organization in 1933. Meanwhile, Germany under Adolf Hitler was rapidly rearming. The tri-global order was disintegrating. At the 1935 conference, Japan insisted on equal naval rights or threatened to leave all limitation treaties. Yamamoto was chosen as the senior military representative due to his technical expertise and diplomatic experience, making him a formidable advocate for Japanese demands. However, the conference failed to achieve any agreement. In response, Japan withdrew from the naval limitation system in 1936, marking the end of negotiated arms control. The failure of the 1935 conference was a significant turning point. The absence of treaty restrictions led to a surge in naval construction across all major powers, though not uniformly. American shipyards ramped up their programs at a pace that Japanese industry found impossible to keep up with. Yamamoto's worst fears were coming true as the lack of artificial constraints exposed the industrial gap between Japan and America. In 1936, he was promoted to Vice Minister of the Navy, one of the highest administrative roles in naval command. From this position, Yamamoto became more outspoken against policies that could potentially lead to a conflict with the United States. When Japan invaded China in 1937, Yamamoto openly opposed the move, recognizing that an extended land war would deplete Japanese resources and escalate tensions with Western nations. His stance incurred the wrath of nationalist groups within the military establishment, with young army officers branding him as a traitor and extremist newspapers questioning his allegiance. Death threats became a regular occurrence for Yamamoto. In December 1937, Japanese aircraft attacked and sank the American gunboat Panay on the Yangtze River in China. Clearly marked and flying American flags, the attack took place during daylight hours, resulting in 2 fatalities and numerous injuries among American sailors. The incident sparked an international crisis and brought Japan and America closer to war. As Vice Minister of the Navy, Yamamoto personally apologized to U.S. Ambassador Joseph Grew over this event, which was seen as unprecedented. Senior Japanese officials seldom issued direct apologies to foreign diplomats regarding military actions, but Yamamoto recognized the severity of the situation. The Paine incident highlighted that certain factions within the Japanese armed forces were operating recklessly and beyond the control of both civilian authorities and high-ranking military leaders. Young officers in China were taking steps that could spark a conflict with America, while political figures in Tokyo lacked the authority to rein them in. Yamamoto's apology to Grew was driven by both diplomatic exigencies and his personal sense of responsibility. He sincerely regretted the incident as he viewed it as a harbinger of the war he desperately sought to prevent. In his diary, Grew observed that Yamamoto appeared genuinely troubled by the attack and concerned about its impact on Japanese-American relations. However, Yamamoto's apology and opposition to aggressive policies made him vulnerable to criticism. Resistance against Yamamoto intensified considerably. Young military personnel, especially from the Army, openly criticized him along with other admirals who opposed expansionist strategies and alliances with Germany. They branded these officers as defeatists, questioned their loyalty to the emperor, and implied that opposing expansion was tantamount to treason. Threats against Yamamoto became more specific and credible. Intelligence reports indicated nationalist groups planning his murder. These threats were not mere political rhetoric but concrete operational plans with detailed targets, methods, and schedules. As a result, the Navy assigned constant security for Yamamoto's protection. He could no longer venture into Tokyo without guards, and his residence was under surveillance. His office was under strict surveillance by military police who were ostensibly there for his protection, but actually to prevent him from taking any actions that would conflict with national policy. The danger escalated to such a degree that Yamamoto's close associates urged him to tone down his public statements. However, Yamamoto remained resolute and refused to back down. During a meeting of senior naval officers in 1938, he delivered an address that was documented by various sources. To die for the emperor and nation is the ultimate aspiration of every military man, Yamamoto declared. After a valiant and arduous struggle, flowers are scattered across the battlefield, but if one wishes to take another's life instead, a soldier will still face eternity for his country. The life or death of an individual holds little significance compared to the empire's fate. His statement was both fatalistic and defiant, conveying that he would not alter his stance due to fear of assassination. The crisis peaked in September 1940 when Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. Throughout the negotiations, Yamamoto had been one of its most vocal opponents. He contended both publicly and privately that the alliance would serve no positive purpose for Japan, while making war with America almost inevitable. He noted that Germany and Italy were embroiled in European conflicts and could not offer assistance to Japan in the Pacific theater. Additionally, he pointed out that American public opinion, which had been divided on involvement in foreign disputes, would solidify against Japan if it aligned itself with Nazi Germany. Yamamoto's opposition to the Tripartite Pact was well documented. His views were expressed in cabinet meetings, discussions with civilian leaders, and conversations among naval officers. Various documents document his warnings about the pact being both strategically unsound and ethically questionable. Intervened, likely saving Yamamoto's life by making a significant move on August 30th, 1999. That day, Yonai appointed Yamamoto as the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet and dispatched him to sea duty. This decision effectively removed Yamamoto from Tokyo, where assassins could have targeted him, while also placing him in command of Japan's most formidable military unit. However, it left him in a highly challenging situation. Although he was against war with America, if such conflict occurred, he would be the officer tasked with leading it. In mid-1940, Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe directly queried Yamamoto about the potential outcome of a hypothetical war with the United States. Yamamoto provided an unvarnished and candid analysis. Ordered to engage in combat, he assured Kono that Japan could experience significant initial successes for up to 6 months or even 1 year. During this period, dramatic victories were possible, along with territorial gains throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Yet, Yamamoto expressed a profound lack of confidence regarding the second and third years of such a conflict. This statement became renowned in Japanese military circles and was frequently cited within government circles during various discussions and planning sessions. However, it was often misinterpreted or overlooked entirely. Politicians focused on the initial 6 months of victory and territorial expansion, hoping for a quick triumph before American industrial capabilities could be fully harnessed. They neglected the subsequent years when Yamamoto predicted mathematical defeat due to America's mobilized production capacities. Yamamoto attempted to further clarify his position, but faced resistance in effectively communicating these critical insights. In January 1941, he penned a letter to Diet member Sasakawa Ryowachi, who had recently toured Japanese naval forces, and expressed his faith in Admiral Yamamoto's leadership, believing it would secure victory for Japan. Yamamoto acknowledged the compliment but also issued a sobering warning. He pointed out that defeating the United States required more than seizing some American territories or even occupying San Francisco. Japanese troops would have to traverse the entire North American continent and force the U.S. government to surrender in Washington, D.C. Yamamoto posed a rhetorical question about whether Japan's political leaders truly possessed the resolve needed for such an endeavor. Evident they lacked that determination. Therefore, he advised against initiating hostilities. However, by 1941, the decision had slipped out of the hands of officers like Yamamoto and even moderate politicians like Kono. The military was increasingly advocating for war. The army sought access to Southeast Asian resources, while nationalists were confident that Japan's spiritual strength would triumph over America's material advantages. Meanwhile, the strategic situation was worsening rapidly. In July 1941, Japan occupied southern French Indochina, positioning its forces close to British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. This move prompted a swift reaction from the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands in the form of an oil embargo. Instantly, Japan found itself deprived of 80% of its petroleum imports. With reserves sufficient for only 3 years under peacetime conditions, but just 18 months during wartime, an urgent strategic dilemma emerged. Japan faced a critical choice: either withdraw from China and Indochina, thereby accepting national disgrace and abandoning years of military expansion, or launch a full-scale invasion to seize the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, knowing it would likely trigger war with America. In October 1941, Hideki Tojo ascended to the position of prime minister. Tojo was a military general, nationalist, and proponent of war. He harbored animosity towards Yamamoto politically. Numerous commentators believed Yamamoto's career had reached its end. However, his immense popularity within the Navy shielded him from harm. The admirals recognized that no other officer could command the combined fleet as effectively. Even Tojo acknowledged that if conflict erupted, Japan needed its top strategist at the helm. Thus, Yamamoto retained his position. When the decision to wage war was made in November 1941, despite personal reservations, Yamamoto complied with military protocol and followed orders. He meticulously planned the assault on Pearl Harbor. The operation showcased remarkable strategic acumen, but also entailed immense tactical risk. It stemmed from a dire need rather than unwavering confidence in victory. Yamamoto understood that Japan's sole opportunity for success lay in eliminating the U.S. Pacific Fleet before it could retaliate. By destroying American battleships and carriers during the initial strike, Japan would gain 6 to 12 months to fortify defensive positions across the Pacific and secure vital resources before U.S. industrial capacity could rebuild its fleet. This plan contradicted decades of conventional Japanese naval strategy, which emphasized decisive engagements close to home waters. Yamamoto proposed dispatching Japan's carrier fleet thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean to attack Hawaii. The Naval General Staff advocated for more cautious operations near Japanese territories, aiming to seize resource-rich areas in Southeast Asia first and lure the U.S. fleet westward into unfavorable conditions. They thought Yamamoto's strategy was overly dangerous and that losing the carriers would be devastating if the operation failed. When his proposal faced resistance, Yamamoto threatened to resign unless it was adopted. Who argued with the naval leadership that attacking Pearl Harbor was Japan's sole opportunity to prevent certain defeat. Without neutralizing the American Pacific Fleet right away, Japan risked being overwhelmed by America's industrial might from day one of the conflict. It could take between 6 and 12 months for the United States to fully mobilize its manufacturing capabilities. If Japan did not secure strategic resources and defensive positions within this timeframe, it would be doomed in the war. Ultimately, his argument prevailed because no one else proposed a viable alternative that promised victory. The naval leadership reluctantly approved the operation while many officers predicted failure. Yamamoto personally oversaw the training for the attack. The mission demanded unprecedented flying tactics never tested in combat. Torpedo bombers had to launch weapons from shallow waters where standard torpedoes would bury themselves in mud instead of hitting their targets. Japanese engineers modified existing designs based on British techniques used at Tirano in 1940, but these enhancements were only partially effective and remained unreliable. Dive bombers needed pinpoint accuracy to strike moving ships or in congested harbors. Level bombers had to hit ships from high altitudes where the enemy could maneuver defensively. Fighter planes also faced tough challenges to dominate Hawaiian airspace with its formidable defenses. Each element of the operation pushed naval aviation capabilities to their limits. On 1941, training was rigorous and realistic, with pilots owning torpedo drop techniques in Kagoshima Bay, a location similar to Pearl Harbor's geography and depth. Yamamoto acknowledged these casualties as an inevitable part of the process, believing it was better to uncover tactical issues in practice rather than in combat. On December 7, 1941, 350 Japanese planes launched from 6 carriers to attack Pearl Harbor. Despite numerous warning signs that American intelligence overlooked or misinterpreted, the assault achieved complete surprise. The raid resulted in significant damage. 18 U.S. warships were either sunk or severely damaged. Over 2,000 Americans lost their lives, with more than 1,000 others injured. The USS Arizona exploded, claiming nearly all its crew members, while the USS Oklahoma capsized. Several other vessels sustained heavy damage. However, the operation did not accomplish its main strategic goal. None of the U.S. aircraft carriers were present in the harbor that day. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were at sea on various missions. The survival of these carriers ensured that American naval air power remained intact and capable of challenging Japanese operations right from the start of the conflict. Furthermore, Crucial facilities such as oil storage tanks, repair docks, submarine bases, and administrative buildings in Pearl Harbor escaped substantial damage. This outcome enabled the U.S. Pacific Fleet to recover much more swiftly than Japanese strategists had envisioned. Ships presumed lost in December returned to service within a few months. The infrastructure vital for sustaining operations in the Pacific remained intact and operational. Despite the tactical triumph of the Pearl Harbor attack, Yamamoto did not celebrate it. Multiple observers noted that while his staff celebrated and congratulated each other, Yamamoto spent the day following the raid withdrawn and silent, exhibiting signs of depression. He comprehended something that others had yet to realize: the strike had stirred American industrial capabilities into action. Into Arctics, public opinion in America, which had been divided over entering the war, was now unified with a resolute determination to defeat Japan. The giant he had observed 2 decades earlier was now fully awake and brimming with an ominous resolve. All of Yamamoto's observations from his time in America would now be used against Japan as it mobilized its entire industrial capacity. For 6 months, Yamamoto's prediction came true in its initial phase. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific unchecked. They seized Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Japanese aircraft carriers conducted raids on Ceylon and ventured into the Indian Ocean. Japanese ground troops advanced through Southeast Asia with little resistance. It seemed as though Japan was prevailing, but this appearance was misleading. The nation was squandering its limited resources at an unsustainable rate. Oil reserves were dwindling even as newly captured oil fields took months to become operational again. Japanese shipyards could not replace the losses quickly enough, and industrial capacity could not expand fast enough to meet operational demands. Meanwhile, American industry was mobilizing precisely as Yamamoto had warned. By May 1942, the pace at which the United States was mobilizing its industries had surpassed even Admiral Yamamoto's most pessimistic estimates. Manufacturers like Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, Lockheed, North American, Grumman, and others expanded their operations and recruited tens of thousands of workers. Training programs across the southern and southwestern regions were churning out thousands of newly trained pilots each month. The mobilization effort was all-encompassing. Detroit's automotive plants adapted their production lines to manufacture tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles instead of civilian automobiles. Utilizing assembly line methods owned for car manufacturing, they began producing M4 Sherman tanks at a rate nearing 1,000 per month per factory. Steel mills ramped up production to meet the growing demand for ships, vehicles, and weaponry. Aluminum output surged to support aircraft manufacture. Rubber production shifted almost entirely to military needs. Chemical plants expanded to produce explosives and propellants. In 1942, American petroleum production surpassed 300 million barrels, accounting for 63% of global output. California oil fields alone generated more crude than all the Japanese-occupied territories combined. Texas wells operated non-stop at unprecedented levels that dwarfed Japan's access to resources. Pipeline networks were constructed to link oil fields with refineries and ports, facilitating continuous military operations. These figures were impressive and verifiable. By 1943, American shipyards had launched more tonnage in a single year than Japan managed throughout the entire war. In 1944, U.S. aircraft production reached 1943 planes compared to Japan's peak of 28,000. Over the course of World War II, the United States manufactured over 86,000 tanks. American truck production surpassed 2 million vehicles. The manufacturing output was staggering. Crucially, American industry managed to uphold quality standards, even as it ramped up production. Ships were launched swiftly and operated reliably. Aircraft churned out in large numbers met performance requirements. Weapons produced in mass functioned correctly. This industrial system did more than just produce vast quantities. It generated effective military equipment on a scale that dictated strategic outcomes. Shipyards lacked the capacity to replace carrier losses during the war, while Japan managed to build only 6 large carriers throughout the conflict. In contrast, America launched over 100 carriers of various types. Japanese aircraft production peaked in 1944, but then declined as raw materials grew scarce. American aircraft production continued its upward trajectory through 1945. Japanese tank manufacturing never exceeded a few hundred units per year, whereas American output remained consistently high at several thousand tanks monthly after 1942. The industrial disparity was precisely what Yamamoto had calculated 2 decades earlier, and it shaped the war's outcome as he predicted. The pivotal moment arrived with the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Yamamoto devised an operation to draw American carriers into a decisive engagement, aiming for numerical superiority that would enable Japan to destroy the remaining U.S. fleet and compel America to negotiate peace before its industrial might became too formidable. The battle marked a devastating loss for Japan. 4 of its aircraft carriers were sunk, and hundreds of skilled pilots perished. The offensive capabilities of the Japanese Navy were severely crippled as a result. Perhaps most significantly, this engagement took place nearly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, aligning with Admiral Yamamoto's predictions to within weeks. Following Midway, the conflict transformed into a battle of industrial might. American manufacturing prowess surged forward, whereas Japan struggled to match the production pace. In 1943 alone, U.S. shipyards launched more aircraft carriers than Japan managed throughout the entire war. By 1944, American factories churned out more planes in a single year than Japan's total wartime output. The volume of oil extracted from American fields within a month surpassed what Japan had captured from all its occupied territories combined. These figures mirrored Yamamoto's grim projections made 2 decades earlier when he studied the United States' industrial capacity. Assembly lines continued to operate, and factories remained productive, leaving Japan unable to respond effectively. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communication plans, revealing Yamamoto's travel itinerary. He was scheduled to conduct an inspection tour across forward bases in the Solomon Islands. Admiral Chester Nimitz found himself grappling with a challenging choice. Targeting Yamamoto would yield significant psychological gains but risk exposing America's ability to decipher naval communications. Ultimately, Nimitz deemed the potential benefits outweighed the risks involved. Yamamoto was indispensable. On April 18, 1943, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters flew a distance of over 400 miles from Guadalcanal to intercept Yamamoto's transport plane as it approached Balliol Airfield. They shot down his aircraft while it was flying over the jungles near Bougainville Island. Yamamoto perished in the crash, and he was 59 years old at the time of his death. He had served less than 4 years as the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet. American media hailed the demise of the mastermind behind the attack on Pearl Harbor, while Japanese propaganda mourned a national hero who died in service to the emperor. He was neither an aggressive warmonger eager for conflict, nor a pacifist reluctant to engage in warfare. Rather, he was a pragmatic realist who comprehended the industrial realities and endeavored to prevent his nation from engaging in a war that would ultimately be disastrous. The irony of Yamamoto's career is striking. For almost 2 decades, he had warned Japan about America's formidable industrial capabilities. He repeatedly argued that a prolonged conflict with the United States was unwinnable. He opposed every policy that drove Japan towards war and faced threats to his life for his prophetic warnings. Despite this, when the inevitable war arrived, Yamamoto found himself ordered to lead it. Each of his warnings went unheeded, and each prediction he made came true. Following Japan's surrender in 1945, historians began to scrutinize the documentation and records from Japan's decision-making process. Yamamoto's cautionary statements were well documented. Detailed accounts from the 1920s about meeting minutes captured his conversations with political leaders, including his famous declaration that Japan could run wild for 6 months before facing significant challenges. Consequently, Japan entered a conflict with the nation Yamamoto knew could outlast them in a long-term war. Prince Fumamaru Kono, who had questioned Yamamoto about the prospects of war as prime minister, did not live to see Japan's surrender. On December 16, 1945, he took his own life by ingesting potassium cyanide rather than endure arrest for war crimes. Although he briefly served in the post-war cabinet, increasing suspicion led to his impending detention. The evening before his scheduled arrest, Kono spent hours discussing China's invasion and negotiations with the United States with his son, deeply reflecting on his heavy responsibility toward the emperor and the Japanese people. He had consistently opposed entering a war against America until it was too late. During the summer of 1941, he suggested an unusual meeting with President Roosevelt in Honolulu to prevent a conflict. However, his political influence was insufficient to counteract the militarists' dominance. Upon Hideki Tojo's appointment as war minister in Konoe's cabinet, Kono lost control over military policy and eventually resigned in October 1941, mere weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The key takeaway from Yamamoto's narrative is not about naval strategy or strategic planning, but rather about how industrial capacity correlates with national power in modern warfare. In the era of industry, wars are not solely won through tactical brilliance, courage, or superior training. These elements play a role in single battles. However, sustained conflicts between industrialized nations hinge on production capabilities. Victory goes to those who can outproduce their adversaries by leveraging abundant natural resources, advanced manufacturing systems, and swift conversion of civilian output to military use. Yamamoto recognized this reality and attempted to convey it to his nation, but Japan disregarded his insights. Throughout World War II, American factories churned out roughly 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, millions of trucks, thousands of ships, and an almost limitless supply of ammunition and other materials. In contrast, Japan's total industrial output fell far short of matching the United States in every significant category, often by a ratio of 5-to-1 or more. These figures were foreseeable, as Yamamoto had roughly estimated them 2 decades before the war commenced. He was well aware of what American automotive plants could accomplish. He understood what American oil fields could provide and what their steel mills were capable of producing. He had witnessed these capabilities firsthand during his time in America. Tragically, this information was known at the highest echelons of Japanese government and military leadership. Or, it was documented extensively, discussed thoroughly, and readily accessible to decision-makers. However, it was systematically overlooked because it contradicted nationalist ideology. Wartime industrial production figures. Japanese aircraft manufacturing reached a peak of 28,000 planes in 1944, compared to the United States production of 96,000 aircraft the same year. Historians studying the Pacific War now view Yamamoto as a multifaceted individual, a tactical genius who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, a strategic realist who opposed the war that necessitated such an action, and a military professional who followed orders even when he foresaw them leading to national disaster. Furthermore, he is recognized as a prophet whose warnings were recorded, disseminated, yet disregarded. Although the famous quote attributed to Yamamoto about awakening a sleeping giant may be apocryphal, likely fabricated for Hollywood films, the sentiment it conveys rings true. Yamamoto was aware that an attack on America would unleash industrial might Japan could not compete with. He warned that once the United States committed to total war, it would refuse any negotiated settlement. Furthermore, he predicted that for 6 months after the initial assault, Japan would experience significant success before being hindered by industrial realities. These forecasts stemmed from his observations during his time in America in the 1920s, particularly from studying oil fields in Texas and comprehending American manufacturing capabilities. His insights also reflected an understanding of how modern warfare is as much about industrial production as it is about military prowess, and he was willing to acknowledge mathematical facts even when they contradicted national pride and ideological beliefs. Yamamoto's life underscores that having precise strategic intelligence alone does not guarantee avoiding disastrous choices. Japan possessed accurate intelligence regarding America's industrial capacity, and multiple leaders grasped its implications. Despite warnings from the country's most esteemed naval strategist, Japan still chose to go to war. The factories continued their production, and events unfolded exactly as Yamamoto had calculated 2 decades earlier when he studied American industry and foresaw its impact on future conflicts. If you found this narrative engaging, please take a moment to like this video. Words deserve recognition. Subscribe for more untold stories that matter. Each example highlights the connection between precise intelligence and strategic choices. We would be delighted to hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment below sharing your location.